Good morning. Today's Old Testament reading is a continuation of the story from Ezra and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. It's a great story, filled with lots of intrigue, politics, pride, prejudice, bribery, sedition, all the ingredients for a great tabloid story for today's newspapers. The background is the Jews have been repatriated to Israel, and the story picks up with the local inhabitants offering to help the Jews rebuild the temple, because they'd also been worshiping God in the Jews' absence. But the Jews said, no, God only belongs to us, not to you. Unfortunately, all this happened some 600 years before Paul's vision in the New Testament of the cornucopia of food descending from heaven. Anyway, the locals naturally got mad and tried to stop the temple rebuilding project. Finally, the governor of the whole province west of the Jordan River and his secretary wrote a letter to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. I'll pick up the reading in Ezra chapter 4, beginning with verse 11. You can find this on your Pew Bible on page 368. Now, this is a copy of the letter they sent. To King Artaxerxes, your servants, the people of the province beyond the river, send greetings. And now may it be known to the king that the Jews who came up to you from us have gone to Jerusalem, and they are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now may it be known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be reduced. Now, because we share the salt of the palace, it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor. Therefore, we send and inform the king, so that a search may be made in the annals of your ancestors. You will discover in the annals that this is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, that sedition was stirred up in it from long ago. On that account, this city was laid to waste. We make known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and its walls finished, then you will have no possession in the province beyond the river. The king sent an answer to Rehum, the royal deputy, and Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river. Greeting. And now the letter that you sent to us has been read in translation before me. So I made a decree, and someone searched and discovered that the city has risen up against kings from long ago, and that rebellion and sedition have been made in it. Jerusalem has had mighty kings who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. Therefore, an order is issued, made to people cease, that the city not be rebuilt, until I decree. Moreover, take care and not be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to hurt the king? Then when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and the scribe Shimshai and their associates, they hurried to the Jews in Jerusalem and by force and power made them cease. At that time, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped and was discontinued until the second year of the reign of King Darius in Persia. Here ends the reading, the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, Walter gave a nice background to the first part of our story, and so a little background is necessary for the second part here. That's the resistance, appealing to King Artaxerxes to stop the building, and then the Jews appeal to King Darius to restart the building. And so they have done that. And here is King Darius' reply. Now you, Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozani, and you, their associates, the envoys in the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you will do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these people in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests in Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his children. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of the house of the perpetrator, who then shall be impaled on it. The house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has established his name there overthrow any king or people that shall put forth a hand to alter this or to destroy this house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. Then, according to the word sent by King Darius, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai, and their associates did with all diligence what King Darius had ordered. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts together be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Persistence and resistance. You probably know by now that I like a good play on words, and I didn't have to work too hard to find one this week. These two words and the opposing forces they represent are two halves of our biblical story today from the book of Ezra. And right away, I thought I have the perfect sermon illustration right here on our property. Our capital campaign project has thus far been a story of resistance and persistence. The town of Newcastle was just doing its due diligence with zoning regulations, but it seemed like a nightmare of resistance as we went to meeting after meeting to address the zoning board, the planning board, the architectural review board, and back to the town board. It took the persistence of our architect and our master plan team, especially that of our leader, Rob Marlowe, to finally get the permit and get the work started. So resistance and persistence is relevant right here and right now. Well, this is the third in our summer sermon series in the twin books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which tell the story of the return of the people of Judah from the Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple and the walls around Jerusalem. For a story that took place 2,500 years ago, it is amazing how it touches upon contemporary issues in our world today, as Walter alluded to. The first week we looked at the incredible generosity of King Cyrus, as he not only allowed the people to return to Jerusalem, but he made restoration of all their stolen gold and silver vessels used in temple worship. And so we looked at restoration and restitution as it is in our headlines in our nation as we seek to find ways to redress old wrongs to groups of people like Native Americans and African Americans. And then last week we reflected on the joy of returning home, which spoke to issues in present-day Jerusalem, the longed-for home of both Israelis and Palestinians. This week, the words resistance and persistence speak to current issues in our society. In our current political climate, the words resist and resistance have taken on new meaning. Did you know there is a Resist Foundation and a newly formed political party called the Resistance Party? Both groups are committed to resisting the agenda of the current administration on issues from immigration to the environment. The hashtag resist came into common use soon after the election and quickly became the rallying cry for what we'd normally call the opposition. In the British parliamentary system that I grew up with, the party not in power is known as the loyal opposition. It's meant to be a healthy check and critic of the government to help keep it honest. Well, there's nothing loyal about the resist movement. These are stressful times in our nation, and the divisions are deep and getting deeper. But there is a time and a place for resistance. For example, this congregation was part of a resistance movement within the Presbyterian Church, a movement that resisted the policies that discriminated against gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. We advocated first for full membership in the church, then full access to leadership and ordination, and most recently to full marriage equality. It was a journey of resistance that involved lots of persistence, and many of you were part of that struggle. In our story from Ezra, the returned exiles have come to Jerusalem and they're busy rebuilding the temple when the local people offer their first resistance. It's an interesting story, as Walter alluded to, lots of nuances and intrigue. So let's get a little background. I loved what Walter said, and I don't know if I can shed any more light, but I'll try. The people who were sent into exile were the elites of the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. Now, if you recall from Sunday school, there were 12 tribes of Israel, named after the 12 sons of Jacob. And after that golden era of David and Solomon, the kingdom split into two, the northern half and the southern half. The northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, which left only Judah and Benjamin, known as the Kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. And it too was overrun by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. And 70 years later now, those refugees are returning home to Jerusalem. But the people who still lived there were distant relatives, of course. They were the remnant of both the northern and southern kingdom who had remained in the land. Some of them had remained faithful to Yahweh, but most had forgotten the law of Moses and had taken on the religion and customs of the surrounding people. And so this sets up a dilemma for the people who are rebuilding the temple. Do they trust the locals and welcome them into the project, or do they remain suspicious and doubt their sincerity? At first, the local people said they wanted to join the rebuilding and offered to help. But the Bible tells us that the leaders of Judah said, no, the work has to be done by those faithful to Yahweh, and they declined the help. Now, this sounds rather exclusive, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very neighborly at all. In reality, they were the newcomers to the land after being gone for 70 years. You think they might have been just a little more friendly. Well, scholars puzzle over this reaction to the offer of help. Was it petty tribalism or a shrewd, cautious attitude about the sincerity of the surrounding people? Well, as the story goes on, it seems that their suspicions were justified because the locals turned hostile very quickly. Their support, if it was ever there, was shallow. In fact, perhaps their goal was to infiltrate the ranks of the Judahites and then meddle in the rebuilding project. When you read their letter to Artaxerxes, it's hard to imagine that they truly wanted to ever see the temple rebuilt in that troublesome city, Jerusalem. Well, this exclusive attitude on the part of the returned exiles doesn't sit well with us Presbyterians who pride ourselves on inclusivity. But there's always been some measure of exclusivity when it comes to religion. By definition, there are those who are part of the faith community and those who are not. Recently, I came across an article about the landmark Baptist movement. I'd never heard of them, but it was an interesting article. These are a group of Southern Baptists, or Baptists in the south of this country, who believe a faithful core can be traced back from their churches to New Testament times. They are the true church, they think, that followed the apostles' teachings on governance, baptism, and membership. To them, churches who do such crazy things as baptize infants are apostate and not part of the true church. Well, you can understand their self-righteous attitude when you realize that they were the minority group that was persecuted by everyone, Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed churches alike, during the Reformation era when they were known as the Anabaptists. Well, attitudes of exclusivity are understandable at times, but it is never the long-term solution. Tribalism and isolationism always lead to conflict. The biblical story is filled with examples of God's people reaching across cultural and religious lines, like the story from the New Testament that Walter referred to, showing the inclusive love of God across those boundaries. But this is not one of those times. This is a time of caution and of tension. This is a time of resistance that will require persistence. So, the people write to the king of Persia, who has now followed Cyrus, King Artaxerxes, and the local people, that is. They appealed to his insecurities about rebellion and the loss of tax revenue. And so he responded by ordering the shutdown of the construction project. It's as though he called the building inspector and told him to revoke their permit. Except the penalty for any violation was worse than a fine that we might get if we did something wrong here. Any violator was to be impaled on the beam of their house, which was going to be destroyed. Wow. So needless to say, the building project came to a halt for a while. But in chapter 5, the very next chapter, we learn that the people didn't stop building for long. They kept on working quietly, and when they were again confronted, they wrote to the man who had now replaced Artaxerxes, King Darius. And this time their letter got in first, and they reminded Darius about the decree from Cyrus a generation earlier. And once Darius realized that, he issued a decree that not only should they get their building permit returned, but he promised to pay for the entire building project. The only condition was that they would pray for him once the temple was built. Like Cyrus before him, Darius was impressed by Yahweh, the God of Judah. He respected the persistence of these people, and he respected the God that they believed in. Their faithfulness to their God spoke truth to power, and the temple was rebuilt. In chapter 6, we read about the joy of worshiping once again in the temple. Our second reading that we shared this morning ended at verse 16. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. The story goes on to describe their first Passover in the restored temple, and the chapter ends with these words. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. They were not only satisfied with their own work, but they recognized their success as a gift from God. They celebrated with joy because the Lord had truly filled them with joy. This joy is the kind that can only come after overcoming obstacles and resistance to achieve a long-sought goal. The story this summer about the rescue of the boys stranded in a flooded cave in Thailand was just such a story, wasn't it? The whole world felt the joy of those boys coming out of the cave into the caring arms of doctors and nurses and eventually their families. The persistence of those divers who spent days and days in conditions so dangerous, one diver lost his life. Their persistence finally paid off. And the joy of seeing the smiling faces of those boys was felt the world over. Well, we had a moment of joy on our mission trip this summer that was not that dramatic, but it was truly memorable. It was on the evening of our first full day of work on the construction site and Vacation Bible School. After the evening service with all the other groups, we had our own time of sharing and reflection. And then we looked at our watch, and with just enough time before it closed at 9, we dashed off to the favorite local ice cream spot called Dairy King. Married to the Dairy Queen, I imagine. They had soft serve cones, including raspberry dipped in chocolate. Doesn't that sound good? It was a beautiful summer evening, and I just sat back and felt pure joy, watching the kids laugh and tell stories about the day as they enjoyed their ice cream. I took note of it as a moment of pure joy. Well, this story from Ezra took place long ago, but you don't have to look too far to find stories of persistence overcoming resistance, and they are inspiring stories. There's a story of Steve Jobs and Apple Computer, the company he started in his garage in the 70s. Well, in the 80s, he faced resistance from the board of directors to the point where he was fired. Looking back, he said at first he was depressed and confused. How do you get fired from your own company? But he spent the next decade experimenting with technology and ideas without the pressure of running a huge corporation. So when they begged him to come back, he had the new ideas that brought us the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone, and his persistence transformed the way the world communicates. A similar story is that of Millard Fuller, the founder of Habitat for Humanity. After 29 years, he got in a dispute and faced stiff resistance from the board of directors, with the result that they fired him just months before he was to retire as president. But Millard Fuller was not a quitter. He persisted with his dream of building homes for those in need of decent, affordable housing, and he started the Fuller Center. The homes we built in Haiti and the trip that Walter is going on this fall, you can read about in our bulletin, are part of the legacy of Millard Fuller's persistence. And so today, Habitat for Humanity and the Fuller Center are not competitors, but both organizations are building homes with volunteer labor, with neighbor helping neighbor. Resistance and persistence in ancient Israel and in 21st century Westchester County. It's a common story. It's a human story. So if you're facing resistance in your life right now, take courage from this ancient story. Trust that God will lead you to a path through the resistance. It may take you off course from your original plan, but with God's help, you can always find a way. And here's a basic truth that should give you courage. The joy you experience is always deepened by the strength of the resistance you overcome. So give thanks for the resistance. It will strengthen your persistence and deepen your joy. Resistance and persistence. Last time I'll say those words today. 2 words that are fun to say but challenging to do. May our persistent God help you overcome any resistance that would keep you from experiencing the joy that God intends for you. Amen.